All right, Alexander, let's talk about Nord Stream, New York Times, Washington Post, site, and the Times. Also the BBC, I believe. We had five publications, if I'm not mistaken, five publications that came out with their Nord Stream stories. All of them point to pro-Ukrainian, anti-Putin, Russian national groups that did this Nord Stream sabotage by renting a yacht and taking that yacht to the Baltic with thousands of pounds of explosives and blowing Nord Stream up, just like that. Anyway, we'll get into that story. A couple of more interesting stories that I think we can touch upon in this video. I'd like your thoughts on McCarthy turning down Zelensky's offer to visit Kiev. I thought that's interesting. And I'm also interested in the story from Politico, which said that the U.S. is now looking at ways to place missiles on MiGs. And President Duda, Polish president, he came out with a statement yesterday and said Poland is absolutely ready to give over their MiGs to Ukraine. And I think Slovakia has stated, this was like about a week or 2 weeks ago, that they will give over something like 10 MiGs. So it seems like the plan as far as fighter jets goes is MiGs fitted with American missiles. That seems to be the workaround arrangement that they've figured out for Ukraine. Anyway, so three interesting stories. You want to take on the Nord Stream one first?
Yeah, let's do that. The six guys and a boat, because of course what we're told is, I mean, we now have two alternative accounts of what happened. We've got Seymour Hersh's account, which is very detailed, goes into enormous granular detail, discusses how the operation was carried out by a team of divers from the U.S. Navy training school, Panama City in Florida, by the way. I've in some places referred to Panama, the country, but in fact it's a place in Florida. Just to make it clear that's corrected. But anyway, he's provided huge detail. He's explained the process of decision making. He's explained that it's all derived on sources. He's given a very, very granular account of it. The Norwegians were involved. Properly trained professional divers were involved. And we now have the alternative story. Came out a month later, and it's six guys, 5 men, 1 woman on a yacht, paid by a Ukrainian oligarch, 2 divers apparently amongst this group of 6. They floated to the Nord Stream pipelines. They knew where they all were apparently. By the way, how did they know? I mean, I don't know, but anyway, they apparently did know, and they supposedly in the midst of lots of warships and ships of various descriptions moving around the Baltic Sea, they single-handedly carried out this enterprise. Now, I mean, you can see the Hollywood movie on the way, you can read the thriller, but I have to say I've been getting a deluge of information from all kinds of people, and who have technical knowledge in this field, and they all tell me this is impossible. I mean, I don't think this is difficult to understand. I mean, if you're talking about diving, for example, ordinary diving, with scuba diving and all that, you can't reach these sort of depths. I mean, it's just, you need special equipment to do that. This yacht, which was left apparently behind with, Ukrainian passports lying around just so that they could be found. Traces of explosive apparently also there to be found. Anyway, this yacht isn't capable of operating the kind of sophisticated equipment that you would need. So that already makes this story fundamentally implausible to the point of impossibility. And on top of all of that, you have, the big question. I mean, do you really carry such vast quantities of explosive on a boat like this? So the whole thing looks fantastic. And I think the media knows this, because one of the most interesting things about this story is that after the New York Times, BITCHUTE, and London Times published it, we had a few reports, and then it's gone dead. Nobody it's not there in the British media today. It was got a certain amount of traction. But I think that this time it was just too fantastic to be believed. And I gather that there are officials in Germany who are going around saying, this has completely blindsided us. We don't know who in Germany believes this, but, nobody told us anything about this up to now. And so you're getting reports from Germany that there's actual official skepticism in some quarters about this. And, of course, the Russians have ridiculed the whole story, as I think most people who look at it would ridicule it too. So why was this story published at all? Well, I think it's not difficult at one level. I mean, they had this Seymour Hersh story. It was gradually gaining traction. More and more people were referencing it. It was being looked up. It was being listened to on alternative media channels or independent media channels. People were learning about it. So there had to be some other story that had to be put out. And this story was put out. And I think what it has actually done is that, unless we get an awful lot more detail, and unless we start seeing arrests being made and some explanations about the apparent absurdities of the story, I think what it's doing in the meantime is it's actually making a lot of people even more inclined to believe Seymour Hersh, because the official alternative at the moment looks so implausible. And that's how I feel about this story. That's how I feel about it myself. Now, there is one other very curious thing, and that you have to go back to the New York Times article, because not only does it insinuate that Ukraine officially was involved at some level, even whilst saying that, there's no proof that it was, but it gives a damning list of things that Ukraine did, which the United States disapproves of. And it's a fascinating list. It mentions the attack on the Saki Air Base in Crimea, the Engels Air Base, the murder of Daria Dugina, the bombing of the Kerch Bridge, all of these things. There's a whole list of Ukrainian transgressions. And we're told that Ukrainian decision-making is opaque, that the Ukrainians, in other words, lie to the Americans and hide things from the Americans, that the Americans aren't aware of things that Ukraine is doing, and that the Ukrainians do all these bad and crazy things that we've just talked about, even though that doesn't help Ukraine operationally on the battlefield, but it risks alienating European allies. I wonder which ones, by the way. And that, what they've just done with Nord Stream could create further strains between Ukraine and Germany and might undermine the coalition in support of Ukraine. So, and actually veiled but very strong criticism of Ukraine indeed. Now, there is two possible views about this. Firstly, that this is another attempt to create distance between the US and Ukraine, to try to, in other words, pivot away from Ukraine. And I think this is probably true. But the other thing, and I think this is a point which many people are missing, is that there's a lot of implied criticisms here of the Biden administration, because what this article in the New York Times is saying, attributed to these anonymous officials, is that the United States has been allied by the president and his administration with these crazy people who are lying to the United States and are doing these crazy things. So that is actually pretty strong implicit criticism of the president and of his officials, if you think about it. And again, that begs the question, why? Why is this being said in that kind of way?
Well, why? I mean, that was the question that I was going to ask you. But just to expand on what you said, maybe this will help you answer that question. I did a video covering this, and I said the same exact thing that you said just now. And you were talking about this yesterday in your locals live stream as well, which is that ending your video that you uploaded a day ago as well. You talked about how the New York Times article focuses on all of the past things that Ukraine or Ukraine intelligence or whoever is associated with Ukraine did towards Russia while keeping the U.S. in the dark. I said the same thing in the video that I did covering this story, and I focused in on Daria Dugina because I saw in the New York Times article, not only did I see a good paragraph dedicated to Daria Dugina and her assassination, they even put a big photo right in the middle of that article of Daria Dugina, and I thought that's interesting. And then I referenced the Financial Times article where they interview the Bryansk terrorist, and they have a colorful description of him. He's a polyglot who has his own clothing line, but he's crazy. He's a white supremacist. He's anti-Putin, and he's a terrorist. And they talk about Daria Dugina in that article as well, and how Ukraine is associated with some crazy characters, and they do things that keep the U.S. in the dark. And I thought this connection was really interesting because in the Financial Times article, they take it even one step further than the New York Times article, because this guy actually says in that Financial Times article, this terrorist that did the act in Bryansk, he actually says Ukrainian authorities told me to do it.
Exactly.
So I don't know. Exactly. I go back to the question that you asked, and I ask you the same question, which is why.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let's be absolutely clear about this. The Financial Times article, and the Financial Times has very, very close links with people in the United States. I mean, remember about just over a year ago, for example, we were hearing all these reports about the Chinese hypersonic missile test, and who did the U.S. military, the intelligence people in the U.S. place that story with? They did it in the Financial Times. So that shows you how well connected the Financial Times is. It is not a coincidence. I think that's the first thing to say. It's not a coincidence that the Financial Times article saying all those things came out just before the New York Times story. I mean, there are coincidences, but this is not one. There is too much overlap between the stories to assume coincidence here. And clearly there's criticism of Ukraine. Clearly there's criticism of some people in Ukraine. I'll come back to what I said before. There is here implied criticism of the president and of his immediate team. Now, this is speculative, but I am reasonably confident in my speculation. And certain comments made by the Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, by the way, which she made yesterday, have reinforced this. I think that there is a major argument going on in Washington. We're seeing more and more signs of this. We saw that Rand Corporation report a few weeks ago, which we've discussed at great length. We've seen all kinds of articles appearing, people questioning where is the what is the end game, what is the policy, what exactly are we trying to achieve in Ukraine. The military are unhappy. The uniformed military are unhappy about where all this is going. At the same time, we see the neocons who are close to the president pushing back. They want this offensive by Ukraine. They want it launched. And I think what has happened, and this is my own take, is that the Seymour Hersh story, and you remember You said a couple of days ago that it was starting to cause actual damage. And I think it has. I think it's caused damage. I think people said, look, we've got to, at the same time, plug this, stop this, because it's hurting the president and it's hurting the administration. But at the same time, we're going to use the way in which the president himself is being weakened by this story to call into question his entire policy over Ukraine. We're going to highlight the fact that the people in Ukraine that he is supporting and who these people around him are supporting are unpredictable, irresponsible, crazy. They're prepared to do crazy, ruthless, cynical, terroristic things. They're prepared to get into, work with people with incredibly dangerous beliefs, ideological beliefs. And I think this is part of this ongoing argument that's going on in Washington. And people are saying to the president, look, we're going to protect you up to a point over this story. But we want change. We want to start to see things pivot away. So we're both criticising you. We're putting out a story, impliedly criticising you. We're putting out a story which many people are not going to believe and which on the face of it makes almost no sense. That still leaves you weakened. That still leaves you vulnerable. And at the same time, we've used this incident to highlight the concerns we have about Ukraine and about this war that you've led us into.
Yeah. And it also leaves Zelensky very weakened as well. Because, yes, nothing's connected to him yet. But who knows when they just may want to put out a story that connects Nord Stream to him. Like they did in the Financial Times article with this terrorist in Bryansk.
Absolutely.
And
can I...
Right. And today, and just a side note, today the Russians, I believe the Russian ministry, the defense ministry said that the missile strike was in part due to this terrorist activity, which is attributed to the Ukraine government.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. Can I just add something about that? Because, of course, the New York Times article is extremely, it's again, you have to read it very carefully because at one point it appears to distance Zelensky himself from this Nord Stream attack. And then it effectively takes that away. It tells us, Ukraine keeps everything secret. We can't really trust them. And it's perfectly possible that this was decided off the books. In other words, that it was actually decided by Ukraine and by implication by Zelensky himself. It's basically saying we don't even have the proof of that. But it's quite likely that that is what happened. So you're absolutely right. It does weaken Zelensky. And remember, Zelensky was the man that Biden went to see a week ago. Was it 10 days ago now? And they were together in Kiev and they had that meeting together. So this bears to me all the hallmarks, this story bears all the hallmarks of an ongoing battle in DC between, the various factions. And the thing about this New York Times article is that though it purports to help the president, it actually, in an interesting way, undermines him. It calls attention to, as I said, to the nature of the people the president has aligned the United States with. And it does so in a way that I think within the bureaucracy will cause him damage. I should add, by the way, that having worked in government myself, or at least on the fringe of government, and having actually witnessed and seen bureaucratic battles like this, work themselves through. I have experience of this kind of thing, and I know how articles can be planted and how those kind of messages can be set out. And of course, the important thing to understand about these messages is that obviously the public is to some extent being brought in on the picture. But the people that they are mainly telegraphing their concerns to are the other members of the elite, the political class, and the bureaucracy itself. And people within that elite and that bureaucratic class will have no difficulty understanding this article in the New York Times in exactly the way that I've interpreted it.
Yeah, I almost feel like the New York Times article wasn't so much about protecting or shielding Biden. I actually think that article placed more of an emphasis on protecting and shielding the deep state and U.S. intel services, as saying they're the ones that are being kept in the dark. Biden, Sullivan, Nuland, Blinken, they seem to know everything that's going on. But U.S. intel, well, Ukrainian intel and Zelensky, well, he's keeping us in the dark, and he's off doing all of these crazy things, including associating himself, as the Financial Times article lets us know, with white supremacists, white nationalists, and coming from the U.S., a country, a government that is hyper-focused, hypersensitive on the whole white national issue. I found that Financial Times article incredible. That admission I found to be incredible.
Yeah.
So I look at these articles. I don't look at just the New York Times or Financial Times or the Zeit. I'm kind of looking at all these articles as a whole, as a kind of narrative, as a thread. And there's a good lead into the next story. You would think that if Biden's position on Ukraine was strong, if Zelensky's position on Ukraine was strong, then the Speaker of the House would be compelled to go and see Zelensky in Kiev.
Yes.
But he says no. For now.
Yeah,
he may
indeed.
go in the future, but for now, he says no. And he said it in a very strong and determined statement. He says, no way am I going to see you.
Absolutely. Before I just turn to Kevin McCarthy, can I just make one quick point, which of course entirely supports your points about this interview with this Russian by the Financial Times and his ideological beliefs. Note that the New York Times article quite unnecessarily connects the Nord Stream attack with, in effect, that particular individual that the Financial Times interviewed by floating the possibility, for which there is no evidence and which the New York Times itself admits there is no evidence, that some of the people who carried this out were in fact people of Russian ethnicity holding the same ideological views. In other words, the New York Times article was explicitly linking to that article in the Financial Times and was drawing attention, in a way, to the person who the Financial Times interviewed. And why would you do that? Why would you do that if not for the reason that we've been discussing, to highlight the fact that the President of the United States and his team have aligned the United States with people like that. And by the way, your point that this is also intended to protect the deep state is absolutely spot on. It's completely true. This article from the New York Times clearly originates from deep within the deep state in the United States. They know that Nord Stream is potentially a massive problem, so they're protecting themselves, and they are not so subtly blaming the president and his advisors, his core team, the people that we've discussed, Nuland, Blinken, Sullivan, and to some extent Burns. So you could see what's going on. It's a very interesting article. It takes a lot of thinking about to understand it. But let me reiterate again, the people in the political class and in the bureaucracy will understand it completely. For them, it's actually, by the standards of articles like this, fairly clear. And it does demonstrate that there is now a real power struggle, a real argument or battle going on in Washington about the whole policy, direction of policy over Ukraine. Now, let's talk about Kevin McCarthy, because, of course, that plays directly in, as you absolutely rightly said, to the fact that he's said emphatically that he is not going to Kiev. He's going to Taiwan, notice, but he's not going to go to Kiev. And you can see that this individual, McCarthy, who, to be clear, is not from the populist wing of the Republican Party. He's not aligned with Trump. He's not aligned with the Marjorie Taylor Greens, whatever people may say. He is now also distancing himself from the policy. And that shows that even establishment Republicans are getting the message that articles like the one in the New York Times are communicating. And of course, what we see in the New York Times is only the surface. There's all sorts of things going on. Congressional staffers are, being briefed. People are talking. You can imagine that there's a lot of discussion, talk behind the scenes. And the fact that the Speaker has said he's absolutely not going, and he's made that clear in emphatic terms, is another telling sign of disagreement with the policy and, in effect, with the president himself.
Yeah. Okay. So let's get to the policy and let's talk about the F-16s, which it looks like there are going to be no F-16s. And what they're going to do instead is deal with MiGs and somehow equip those MiGs with missiles. And I was reading an interesting tweet, Alexander, yesterday, and it said it was a reference to ammunition, but I think it also carries over to any weapons that are being given to Ukraine. And the tweet said something along the lines of the Ukraine is fighting a war paycheck to paycheck while Russia is a billionaire. And I thought that was a good way of looking at things. And it shows that the policy and the plan of the collective West and the Biden White House is really no plan at all when they're having to backtrack from F-16s, which they were going on and on about. And let's not even get into the tanks either. The tanks have been a complete failure, but they were talking about the F-16s for 2-3 weeks straight, and now it looks like we're getting to some sort of a MacGyver. I don't know if you remember the show MacGyver, a MacGyver type of thing where they're going to take the MiGs and get American missiles on the MiGs, and then they'll be able to give Ukraine all the MiGs that they want. And I think this is pretty laughable, but here we are.
Yeah, absolutely. It's completely laughable. Now let's unpack this, because I'm absolutely, you're absolutely right, by the way. And they are making it up as they're going along. I mean, that's exactly what they're doing, because going back to what we've said many times, what they expected to happen, the economic implosion of Russia and massive protests following the sanctions, that failed to take place. And ever since, they've been improvising. And they're improvising, and the result is that Ukraine is being left, as you said, to survive from paycheck to paycheck, with the checks getting smaller, by the way. Now, F-16s. Huge amount of talk a few weeks ago, as you rightly said, about F-16s. Now, all of the experts, all the militaries said this is a crazy idea. It takes a long time to train pilots to use F-16s. Romania has been trying to convert to F-16s for something like a decade. It's still not fully completed the process. You can't just, put a pilot who's trained to fly a MiG and put him in an F-16. It doesn't work. So what do? You are determined to provide Ukraine with fighter jets. So you go back to a project which was considered, by the way, this time last year and rejected at that time, which is you're going to supply Ukraine with Soviet-era MiG-29s supplied by the Soviet Union in its last years to its Warsaw Pact allies, some of which still fly them. So Poland has some, Slovakia has some, I think the Czechs also have some, and Bulgaria, I believe, also has some. So they're all going to be shipped off to Ukraine. There's a number of problems with this. Firstly, I suspect that there are not as many of these MiGs as people think, because I'm pretty sure that Ukraine has been provided with quite a number of these MiGs, both over the course of this war already, stealthily, and previously. So, yes, there are still some MiGs there, but perhaps not in the huge numbers that some people think there are. Secondly, of course, the MiG-29, it was a good aircraft in its day. Like the F-16, it's a bit long in the tooth. These are older planes anyway. Their avionics, their systems are not up to date. The Russians know all about them. I would have thought there would be meat on the plate, frankly, for the modern Russian air defense system and for Russian fighter jets. But then we come to what I think is the most difficult part of this whole plan: integrating US missiles, US systems onto these old Soviet-era jets. And we're talking about some fairly advanced systems. Now, you are combining, relatively modern American military technologies with 1980s Soviet-era technologies, two completely different technological systems from two completely different technological periods, the 1980s and today. Now, I'm not a technology person, but I have to say, from little I know of technology, I would have thought that the problems of this are enormous. I mean, it seems to me it's like trying to add some of, the apps and updates of modern computers to the kind of computers you had in the 1980s. I mean, I can see how perhaps it could be done, but I can't imagine it can be done easily. And I have to say also that I think that the systems that you're going to get as a result of this are not going to work especially well. Anyway, that's my view.
And this is not about creating this type of 1980s aircraft with modern American missiles and then taking it out for a test drive. You're going to send these pilots to war. So,
yeah,
this stuff better work, which most likely it will not work. But I've got another question for you, and we'll wrap up the video. The fact that they're going to go with MiGs because the Ukraine pilots are not going to be able to learn the F-16 in the amount of time that they need tells me that NATO and the US will in no way enter this conflict with Russia, because I've always held the belief that if we were going to see F-16 supplied to Ukraine, it would be US and NATO pilots. And that would mean that the US and NATO are ready to enter the war. But the fact that they're not going to supply F-16s and they're now going for the MiG option in order to make it more comfortable, let's be honest, more comfortable for the Ukraine fighter pilots because it's a system that they know, tells me that the collective West is in no way eager or ready or capable of entering this conflict with Russia. No fly zones, all that stuff is out of the question. They're set on letting Ukraine fight this proxy war for them. Even Ukraine pilots, even if it means they get a MiG plane with an experimental engineered American missile fix, if we can call it that. That's what this tells me.
I think that's absolutely correct. I think this is completely right. I think that this is. I've been seeing opinion polls coming out of various places in Europe, and of course, the European public was completely opposed to Western people becoming directly involved in Ukraine in that way. And bear in mind, if an F-16 operated by a NATO pilot or a pilot from a NATO country is shot down by the Russians and captured, then the potential effect of that would be very considerable. I mean, the Russians could parade this person, and it might cause an awful lot of concern in Western capitals and amongst Western publics if that happens. So I agree. I think what happened was this. I think a couple of weeks ago, after the tank argument was resolved, or appeared to have been resolved, what we now see is that it wasn't resolved. But anyway, after the tank argument was resolved, there was a determination on the part of some people to send F-16s. And I think that the assumption always was that those F-16s were going to be piloted by Western pilots. I mean, no conceivable way that Ukrainian pilots could be trained in time to pilot them. And I think the militaries in all the Western countries said absolutely not. The polling data came back and said absolutely not. There is no way we are going to intervene ourselves directly in the war in Ukraine. This is something that is politically impossible. Our militaries wholeheartedly reject this. So we're left, therefore, with this dodge of giving the Ukrainians MiG-29s and trying to make these look more effective than they are by sticking American weapons on them, which may sound impressive, but actually must be a technological nightmare to sort out and fix. And I have to say, I can't help but think that this is going to take a very, very long time to do. Now, can I just say, obviously these MiG-29s have been operated by NATO countries. So to some extent, there must be some NATO compatibilities. I mean, some equipment must have been provided to these MiGs to make them compatible with NATO systems. But bear in mind that all of these MiGs have, until the start of this war, been receiving servicing from Russia. So they are still based on Soviet systems of the 80s. I mean, the radar will be Soviet, for example. And the major flight controls, the avionics, they will continue to be largely based on the Soviet systems because, as it is, the Russians have been servicing them. So, and providing the spare parts and doing all of those things. So if they're going to Ukraine with American weapons, as I said, it's going to take a very, very long time to integrate them properly, if that is even possible. And as you rightly said, you're sending men flying these things directly into battle against the Russians. I would have thought better stick to the Soviet weaponry that these MiGs reliably use than try experiments like that with American weapons that on paper might be more effective, but which are going to run into all the problems which we've just discussed.
All right, we will leave it there. The Duran.locals.com. We are also on Rockfin, and look for us on Rumble as well. And go to the Duran shop, 10% off. Use the code. Good day. Take care.